couple sessions. So, oh, all right. Now I could talk, now that we're recording. So one quick note. So right outside my window is my neighbor's house. Their door is like probably 10 feet from me. They're apparently doing backyard work today. And so I'm hoping that it won't be too loud. If I need to shuffle around and find a different room, I can. And so if for any reason it's loud on your end, let me know. Because I saw a backhoe in their driveway earlier. So I don't know what their plans are.
So you're talking like not just mowing a lawn.
Right. Like getting a whole new yard.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And so I am glad that they didn't do it at 7 o'clock this morning to wake the baby up. So I'll take this over that.
The fact that your baby is still sleeping at 7 is a huge win already. I'll give you.
I have a sleeper. I'm a sleeper. That must be an inherited trait. Because she sleeps from she goes to bed at like 7 p.m. and wakes up at 7:30 or 8 in the morning.
I don't even want to hear about it, Kelly. Get going.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm happy for you. Okay.
But of course, I don't know how to do my bedtime because I'm a deviant adult, where appropriate bedtime would be, 8 or 9. But there's some nights that I'm like, no, my husband went to sleep. Let me watch my shows. Anyway. So just a quick overview. Deviant behavior is something that goes against either formal laws. So that would be like speeding, littering, murdering individuals. Technically, I think it's against the law to kill a bat because I think that they're endangered, certain types of bats. I'm getting a nod from Bill over there. So don't rat me out. Don't bat me out to the police. See, it's nice when I have individuals who can appreciate my dad jokes. But yeah, it was self-defense, right? So when looking at those informal or those formal deviant behaviors, while they are black and white, there's a lot of gray area within there. So as a society as a whole, we agree, murder is not okay. We shouldn't kill each other, right? But then as a society, we have things like, oh my God, why can I not think of it?
Like armies, soldiers.
Yep. But when we kill people who are in prison, death penalty, we have the death penalty. That shouldn't have been that hard. And so it's one of those where it's like, if it's sanctioned murder, it's seen to be as acceptable. And so even within things that are formal, like that are supposed to be black and white, there is still some acceptable deviance within there. So if you guys remember yesterday, I talked about like there's things that are acceptable, then there's acceptable deviance, then there's like unacceptable deviance, right? And so that gray area is what is seen as acceptable deviance. So if I were to go out and kill an individual, they would be looking at maybe motivation, right? If I just went and killed somebody because I wanted to, that would be seen differently compared to if I killed someone in self-defense, right? So it's looking at how my behavior matches up with their behavior and the morality within the formal setting. So then there's the informal social norms that we have, which kind of like I talked about, if you face the wrong way in an elevator, people look at you weird. The expectation that if someone's talking to you, you look at them, right? Like I was raised in a time where if I didn't look at who I was talking to, I would be scolded. And so, and it drives me nuts because as you guys know, I have a 13-year-old. So these are learned social norms. So being like, hey, you need to look at me when I'm talking to you. And now it's mainly stop looking at your phone so I know that you hear me, right? It's that social expectation where we associate hearing us with looking at us, right? Like we assume that they're paying attention. So that's a social norm that we have. But I'm sure all of you at some point have looked at somebody and not heard a thing that they said, but you fulfilled the expectation of looking at them, right? You fulfilled those social norms. And then so we'll talk about a couple more theories here, but I had started to talk about theories of deviance. So one of the ones that we talked about was structural functional theory. The idea that society runs in like a cog and wheel type functional format, and each behavior or thing in society has a role. So deviance is an acceptable part of society according to structural functional theory, that we would not be able to function as a society appropriately without it. And we talked about how deviance provides us with a lot of jobs, right? Police officers, parole officers, social workers, things like that. And then we talked a little bit about how suicide functioned in there. Then I kind of want to pick up where we left off with strain theory, because we were starting to have a good conversation about that at the end of last class. And so bringing it back to Batman, let me share that, because I can literally tie anything into my classes. That's the best part about what I teach. And so let me share my screen with y'all. Okay, so we were talking about our deviance typology here. We had talked a little bit about how certain individuals fit into these categories. So if we were to look at superheroes, there are some that are like superheroes, and there are some who are like anti-villain. And there's apparently a distinction between those. So someone like Batman would accept the cultural goal of there being that crime is bad, right? Like that there are bad individuals who should be stopped. But he doesn't always go about the best way to handle that. You could consider these people maybe like vigilantes, where they're not going throughout the institutional means, like the correct way to go about it. So the expected correct way to go about handling criminal behavior would be to notify someone in the police department, letting the police handle it, more of that formalized organization that we have to handle that deviance. But superheroes like Batman, or even like Punisher, for those who, we're going through the Marvel series, we're watching all the Marvel movies, so I know more than I probably should, and I have a boy, so I know more than I should about superheroes, more than I ever did, 10 years ago. But so they fall into that innovation category. So vigilantes, like Batman, Punisher, Daredevil, they're in that innovation. But then we have like the Captain Americas, right, who are in that conformity. They have the cultural goal of keeping society safe, but also feel that there are appropriate methods to do it. They are the capture the individual and letting them go through the criminal justice system rather than handling it themselves, right? So if we were to look at, let me pop that chat open. Yes, so Wonder Woman would be one where I'm a fan of Wonder Woman. Not a fan of the last movie that they made for her, but I am a fan of Wonder Woman. But so she also accepts the cultural goal that there shouldn't be crime, but she almost falls in the middle here, but probably leans more towards conformity in terms of like making sure it goes through the appropriate sources, but she does try to get some information and handle things herself. And so she has some innovative factors, but overall conforms. And so when we look at, the good superheroes, the good superheroes are ones who conform. So there's this whole idea that social control is the goal of keeping deviance in check. That if we can keep everybody the same, behaving how we want them to, conforming, that we'll have a better society. But that's not always the case, right? Like we've tried the social control, we've tried the conformity, we've tried people being the same. That didn't necessarily work out, right? Like we're all individuals, we're all humans. The expectation that we are all the same is, honestly, it's exhausting. And that ties back into that structural functional, where if you feel like you don't fit into that what is expected of you, that social control, you feel like an outcast, you feel unaccepted, you feel that you're not a part of the community, which can really weaken those ties and cause more issues. And so, but since you brought up Batman, I thought it was interesting to talk about this. And I mean, we could even look at villains. So if we look at somebody like the Joker is one of Batman's many nemesis. I don't know what the plural of nemesis is. I don't teach English.
I'm pretty sure it's nemesis, but
Nemesis?
Bill, you got an opinion on this? He was an English teacher.
Oh, Bill, what do you got?
I'd go with nemesis, but I
Yeah,
don't know.
I think so
Nemesis?
too.
Yeah, because nemesis just feels weird to say. Like, it just feels wrong. So the Joker is interesting because at any given point, so if you guys remember, someone can go into these different categories if we're talking about different cultural goals. So we had talked about Al Capone, where he rejected or he accepted that goal of like power and money. So, but he rejected the normal way that people went about getting that, right? So he would be innovation. But we talked about how within the social counterculture that he was in, he technically was doing what was expected, right? He was doing what all the gangsters were doing, where they were accepting the cultural goals to get money, and they were also going through the institutional means, the acceptable means to get that money for those who were gangsters. So as far as like being a gangster in that deviant subculture, he was conforming. But according to normal society, normal such a, it's a bad word really, but like, you know, acceptable society, he was seen as like innovative.
I was listening to a Brene Brown podcast yesterday, and her guest was Ashley C. Ford. And instead of using the word normal, they used the word common.
Common.
Yeah. And like, I know I just like blew my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, common. Because maybe there isn't a normal, but there are things that are common, you know? Anyway,
right.
I just shared that.
Right. So I'll say like typical. That's always like, that's why I go like normal. Like there's not like a normal. And I mean, even the idea of there being a normal creates this deviance, right? Like, and so, because everything ties back to what I talk about. I think that I'm funny. I don't know. I love me. I mean, and so the Joker. Okay, back to the Joker. So the Joker really is chaotic. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the chaos chart where there's like a lawful chaotic, neutral chaotic, where it's the idea that how it's like a square with a bunch of little squares in it that categorize people with how much they are doing the right thing versus following societal expectations to do the right thing. Actually, let me pull that up because that would tie really well into this. Mara, do you know what I'm talking about?
I do not, but I am pleased to learn about it.
Yeah, okay. So let me pull up this. You guys get to see all my tabs on my internet here. So this is the idea that there are good and there are evil. And then there are people who follow the law to get that done and those who don't follow the law to get that done. So they do a lot of these charts with like TV show characters and things like that. So the idea like a Captain America would be a lawful good, like follows the law, does what he needs to do, which would be like that conformity within society, right? Institutional means, cultural goals, doing both of those things, accepting both of those things. Versus someone who's like a lawful evil, where they may be following the law, but doing so in like a morally unacceptable way. So if you guys are familiar with the Preppy murders from New York, it was like 1986, so I guess Preppy murder. This 19-year-old killed this, I think she was 18, they were friends. And the defendant, the man, said that this girl was trying to sexually assault him. So he threw her off and she broke her neck and died. So the lawyer was victim blaming, essentially. So he was saying like, oh, it's because she was promiscuous, she was all of these things, where that's technically legal to do, right? But that is not a socially acceptable way to go about doing it. So that would be like the lawful evil. Does that make sense? And then somebody who's like a vigilante, you could say, would fall into the chaotic category, where someone may be doing things for the right reasons, but going outside of the normal way that you go about doing it. So if you guys are familiar with Daredevil, he's a Marvel character. He, by day, he's a blind lawyer in Hell's Kitchen in New York. By night, he's Daredevil and he fights crime. And so I find him fascinating because he plays both sides. Like, he's lawful good during the day, so going with the law, but in his vigilante character, doesn't follow the law. Like, goes after who he needs to do, like, but he only goes after the individuals who he feels deserve it. And so that's why he falls in that chaotic good, because he's doing good, but not in the appropriate way society would expect someone to do it. And then chaotic evil is your typical villain of like, I would say like a Ted Bundy, who I'll talk about a little bit later, a serial killer, where they're doing evil things in a way that you would expect an evil person to do it. Go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, isn't that the issue though with vigilantes, is that they are the ones that decide what's right and wrong, not the society or the state or whatever. They
Right.
as an individual decide, and that's where vigilantism falls down.
Yes. So that's why it's under the chaotic, because they're not following like the expected way that we would want someone to handle a criminal, right? We would like how Captain America will catch somebody and hand them over to the police. But because it doesn't go through that, that's why it's that chaotic. It's the unpredictable, because they're making the decision.
Right?
We
And
have a
they-
law
and
nicely
they may
written
not
out.
know what's going on, and their barometer or whatever may be way off. They
Right.
don't have the right. They're not the one that has the right to decide.
Right. Right. I should clarify, I am not pro vigilante. I do not think that people should be taking things into their own hands. But they're typically, I don't even know if I can say typically with this, it is common, I would think, that they would be doing it for the right reasons, because they maybe know that that person molested a child, but there's no way to prove it in court, or they want to save that child from having to testify. Like, while they may not have all of the information, in their mind, they're doing it for the right reasons. Does that make sense? Like,
I understand that, but I also think it's wrong.
yeah. Oh yeah.
I also think that in this country, we applaud those individuals. We make all these wonderful movies like you're talking about.
Mhm.
This person did wrong and law didn't do anything about it, so I'm going to take care of it myself,
Mhm.
whether it's Avengers or Superman or whoever, I'm going to take the law into my own hands. And we actually seem to, in this country, encourage people to do that and to do it violently.
Right. And actually, I'll talk about conflict theory and how like social movements and things and how people taking into their own hands has been, a thing, not only recently, but it'll tie into what you're talking about.
Okay.
So Janice wants some examples of the neutral category. So these are the people who could go either way, where so a vigilante may even follow in like the neutral category because maybe they are doing things because they believe it's right, but a little outside of the law, but they may also be following some legal guidelines to it. Like they may be doing illegal things to capture the person, but then turn them over to the police for the justice system. Does that make sense to where it's like they could go either way, or these neutral individuals could be someone who's just existing, someone who's just does what they are supposed to do without any motivation to do outside of the cultural norm. Does that make sense at all? So like a true neutral is someone who like exists and they do what they need to do, they do it how they're supposed to do it, but they're not actually like good people, but they're not like bad people. Does that make sense? Like they're just existing and doing what they need to do. So this might be easier if I go this route. So they have all of these charts. Some are more correct than others. So I'm a Harry Potter fan, so I can fully explain this one to everyone. Maybe too much. And so okay, we'll get bigger. Okay, so are any of you familiar with Harry Potter? Some yes, some no. Okay, so this is a really good layout. So lawful good, this is Hermione Granger. She's the person who does what's right, does what needs to be done, goes about the appropriate way to do it. If someone does something wrong, she notifies authority. Like you would consider these like the good heroes, kind of. So in neutral good, this is Harry Potter, where he does things that are good and for the right reasons, but goes back and forth between doing it legally, like the right way to do it, and taking it into his own hands. So this is Sirius Black. He is Harry's godfather, and he's like a vigilante where he kind of lives by his own rules, does things for, like, he believes he's doing the right thing to help everyone, but goes outside of what we would expect the correct way to do it is. So lawful neutral. This is Argus Filch. He's the
caretaker.
Yeah, he cleans the school that they go to and things like that. And so he wants them to follow the rules of, you need to keep it clean, this is how you're supposed to act, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not
be in bed on time.
Yeah, like, but he's not good or bad. Like, he doesn't really have any personal ties into it. He's like, just follow the rules. A true neutral, which is literally the middle of everything. So one of his quotes is, you ought to be more careful. People will think that you're up to something. He has times where he's seen as more heroic and times that he's seen as evil. Sometimes he does things for the right reasons. Sometimes he does things for selfish reasons. So he kind of just falls in just the middle there. Chaotic neutral. This is Gilderoy Lockhart, who is, at one point, he's one of their instructors, and he does everything for selfish reasons, but he also doesn't want people to know that he does them for selfish reasons. So he falls kind of in that middle category where he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So at one point, he took the memories, well, multiple points, he took memories from individuals and wrote books about it, saying that he did these things. So not lawful, not what we would see as like acceptable. And it wasn't necessarily because it was helping society, but it also wasn't hurting society. So it was kind of just that selfish behavior there. So lawful evil. This is Dolores Umbridge. She essentially was the principal for a space of time, but was not a good person. Like, definitely followed the rules, but definitely went to the extreme on a lot of things. So she would be the type of person where if a student got in trouble for doing something wrong on an assignment, she would take the maximum penalty and give that to them just because she's a mean person. Versus like, as a teacher, if I have a student mess up, I'm like, hey, you know, you messed up, here's a learning experience for it, right? She's like, nope, here's the worst possible punishment that we could have for this. A neutral evil is somebody who does the bad things, but does it in a way that's both for the good of people, but also not for the good of people, but definitely does, like, kills people, very selfish, but not following the laws, but also not completely chaotic and lack of understanding to it. Like, you can kind of follow his logic on it, but you don't usually agree with his logic. And then this is Bellatrix Lestrange. For the lack of better terminology, she's batshit crazy. Like, that's, I think, the best way to describe it. Does really evil things, kills people for fun, but also you never know who she's going to kill. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Like, it just, if she wants to, she does. And so I would say that there's a lot of serial killers that would fit the chaotic evil, to where you don't know their motivation or anything like that. And so within this, it would be like no deviant behavior for lawful, maybe that acceptable deviant behavior in neutral, and then non-acceptable deviant behavior in the chaotic. Does that make sense to everybody? And kind of how that ties into our deviant behavior here a little bit. Janice, did that help you understand neutral a little bit?
A little bit.
Okay. Because neutral is kind of just that,
There.
yeah, almost like morally wrong, but still okay, like not illegal type behavior.
Like, here's my question. If somebody is neutral, is it like you are, you know, like, let's say you're at the grocery store or something and something terrible happens, and instead of stepping in to help, they just go the other way? Would you consider that neutral?
Yeah, because they're not being helpful, but they're also not causing any issues.
Right.
They're just like, not my business, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there are a lot of people like that. Where,
right.
And I mean,
Well,
depending on who you are, I would almost see it as evil if you chose not to do something. So there's less of like a neutral ground within there. But for the sake of this, yes. And of course, everybody's like moral chart's going to look a little bit different, right? But yeah, and I mean, for a long time, people just wanted to stay out of things. So that neutral category, because they're not doing harm, but they're not doing good. They're just like, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, I don't know anything. And so that's kind of that neutral group there. And so just some quick education on the chaos chart here, because I live my life going on tangents. I don't think I've ever taught a class where I was like, here's my lesson plan, I'm going to go straight down. And so, okay. So on to some new stuff besides that. So we have conflict theory. Uh-oh, I'm not showing that to you guys, am I? Okay. So much technology. If you guys have seen Frozen 2, Olaf is the snowman who talks, and he has a theory about how advancing technology is both our savior and our doom. That is accurate. So technology would be like a neutral, right? Technology is true neutral, where it can cause lots of issues or be super helpful. Like, it's not out to hurt you. It's just a tool that you use. Because, you know, why not tie everything back? Sometimes I amaze myself. Anyway, so enough about me. So conflict theory looks at the occurrence of deviance that is due to social, political, and material inequality within society. So this is due to that idea that social norms are developed by dominating classes, by ruling classes. And in each of like the master statuses, so like race, sex, gender, social class, sexuality, and I would say disability is one that has dominating ruling classes. So in the United States, the race that is in most power and is able to make more decisions, things like that, is Caucasian white. These are kind of seen as like the neutrals of society, where, and not tied into like the chart that I just talked about, but when someone in society sees someone who's white, they don't go, that's a white person, right? Like if we see someone in society, we're like, oh, insert minor, like you recognize their race. But typically if someone is white, you don't recognize their race as part of, like, you see that they're white, but your brain doesn't register that. Like it's not really a thought that most people have. And then with sex and gender, male is like the dominant class, and then being cisgender. So cisgender is the idea that the gender that you identify as matches your body. So I was born a girl, woman, and I feel like I identify as my gender as a woman. So I would be cisgender compared to someone who is transgender. Does that make sense? And so born, everything fits in the original package. Social class, the dominating class is the wealthy. They make the rules about the other social classes. They control a lot of things. So if we look at how ideas are dispersed through TV shows, media, the wealthy class owns those outlets, right? So they're able to show whatever they would like to show. So it's going to be less likely to see ideas that are unpopular by the wealthy class dispersed to everyone, since they're that group that does the dispersing. So prior to TV, it was radio, right? Prior to radio, it was newspaper. If you have the means of control, you can control the ideas that are dispersed. So these socially acceptable norms by that group are put out because they're not likely to disperse things that are considered deviant by them. Does that make sense? And if they do, they're definitely showing that they're deviant. And then with sexuality, the being straight or appearing to be straight is that dominating or default class. Essentially, a dominating class is a class that never had to fight for equality at any point during history. Like they were just defaulted into having this. So other races had to fight for the right to vote. Women had to fight for the right to vote. Social class, like those in poverty, are always going against those who are in higher socioeconomic levels. For sexuality, those outside of being straight had to fight for legal rights to be able to marry who they love. So essentially those dominating classes are the ones that haven't really had to fight for any of that. And so those would also be considered groups that have privilege, which is always a difficult category, because that doesn't mean like you were actually given something. That just means that you don't have the struggles that other groups have. When I talk about white privilege, I talk about like, I think of it more of like a minority tax, to where it's like, because you're white, that doesn't mean that you're getting something. Things aren't just given to you, kind of in that concept. You don't have to experience other things, like someone who's a minority walking in a store who is being followed, right? Like those are experiences that people who are minorities or in a minoritized group, those are like the taxes, the social taxes they have to pay. Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of, okay. It's easier with adults than it is with, 18-year-olds with minimal experience with the world. And so this conflict theory of deviance, it can be seen through social movements. I know I say recent social movements. I know the Boston Tea Party is not a recent social movement, but Black Lives Matter is. And so what is seen as deviant is going to depend on the individual, because of how deviant it is seen. So there were individuals who saw that the Black Lives Matter protests were deemed unacceptable because of some of the deviant behaviors that occurred within those, but then found on January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed, saw that as appropriate deviance. Does that make sense? So it's like, it all depends on where you're standing. If you are American, the Boston Tea Party was seen as like acceptable deviance, right? It would be seen as good because it was giving us, it was a step to independence for us. But if you were English, that was seen as like, you're breaking the law. For them, it was black and white, like you were causing a problem, right? So it's that viewpoint really makes a difference. And so like we've talked about, deviance can depend, like how deviant it is, what's acceptable, what's not, depends on the culture, the society, the space and time, different groups that you're associated with, different beliefs that you have, the beliefs that those around you have, right? So these actions are often seen as deviant when it goes against the status quo or against the established social norms. So usually what happens when it comes to protests and things like that, it's stepping stones with social movements where they start with smaller things that fit within the status quo. So whether it's, I was gonna say proposing bills or different things like that, but that might be a little bit, that's a lawful more advanced, right? But someone just speaking out against inequality versus the next step would be like Colin Kaepernick, the football player who was kneeling during the national anthem, where technically that's not illegal, but it was seen as deviant for a lot of individuals. Because if you were born, raised in the United States, you were taught, stand, face the flag, hand on your heart. That's the social norm associated with the Pledge of Allegiance. So that kneeling was seen as deviant behavior, but it wasn't like illegal behavior. Then the protests continued and became, because no one was listening to these smaller attempts, there were larger things that came from that. So protests, marches, just different things like that. And with each of these, looking at it through the lens of conflict theory, something like the death of George Floyd. So that perpetuated or solidified the idea, if you were looking for a reason to be deviant, I could say, then, and if you were looking for that reason to be race related, that would be an example that would be able to support your deviance. Is this making sense to everybody? Okay, sometimes I feel like I'm rambling and I'm not 100% sure. Joyce, you're making a face there. Is this making sense to you?
it. Now, I wasn't exactly sure where you were going with what you were talking about. My observation was that your discussion is, of course, from a white point of view because, white Midwestern point of view.
Mhm.
But because if all around the country, things are different.
Right.
One of the things that you had mentioned was you have to look at somebody when you're talking.
Mhm.
If you're Native American,
That's
considered a
true.
sign of hostility. And that's where a lot of this goes to, is because we don't think about what the other person is thinking about, how their culture is. And that's part, and where they come from.
Definitely. I've had that discussion with a lot of social workers in terms of what's seen as like the majority in the United States feel that eye contact is important. But for those who don't learn about different cultures, they'll assume that everyone is supposed to act that way and it's deviant if they don't. Versus, you're right, like it's seen as disrespectful in the Native American community to look at certain people directly in the eye, to say certain things to individuals. And so cultural competency is huge. It really is. If I had an entire semester to go over deviance, I would absolutely like cultural competence. And I would probably talk more about how race and ethnicity tie into a lot of this and what is seen as deviant and what is not. Because this is the discussion that I have with my students in terms of like police departments. And so there's like our formal laws and your deviant outside of that. But that can also be seen differently depending on implicit bias. So if you have implicit bias is the fact that everyone has bias, like some sort of bias. And it's not necessarily a choice that they make, it's just how they're conditioned in society. So those social norms of, if I'm conditioned to think that eye contact in conversation is essential for me to think that someone's listening to me, if someone doesn't do that, then I'm going to have a problem with it. Does that make sense? But also the way that media, so if you're not taught otherwise, right? So cultural competency is important. But within the media, if we look at who's portrayed as superheroes, right? Like a majority of superheroes are white. A majority of superheroes are men. And so that's kind of like that unconscious conditioning we get in society. So recognizing that we have this implicit bias.
The American Revolution, though, you said that white males never had to fight for their dominant position, but the American Revolution was these white males, and they were wealthy. They're the ones that wanted that they're the ones that turned around with this revolution because they didn't feel they were getting treated correctly by England.
Right.
They were feeling held down or however oppressed by the English society, and that's why the white wealthy males ended up on top, is because this was their revolution.
Right. And so that was like a white wealthy male versus white wealthy male battle. Does that make sense? Like, yeah. And so there wasn't necessarily, it was equal playing field, I guess you could say, to where race wasn't a factor. It was mainly like religion and government that were some of those main factors for that revolution, which then we could talk about.
Oh yeah.
Religious issues also. I'll try not to. What time is it? Try not to go too deep. I only gave myself a few slides because I knew I was going to talk a lot.
Because you
But-
knew I was going to be here and ask all those terrible questions.
Oh, well, it's like I'll see people, like I'll see you and Bob talking to each other, and I'm like, do I want to be like, hey, what are you talking about? Because I'm nosy like that.
Well, you know, white privilege is a thing. We're Methodists,
Mhm.
and can't be embarrassed about saying you're a Methodist.
Yeah.
But and you know, and anybody who's a Methodist or Lutheran or whatever understands that the LGBT, well, the alphabet group
Mhm, mhm,
it's a real issue in our church right
Mhm.
now.
mhm,
So we're working on things like learning what white privilege and stuff is.
mhm,
And I'm going, I did not grow up wealthy. I did not grow up with money. And yet
Mhm.
when they hand me a book that said, but written by a person, I know she's a woman of color, but her family was wealthy, quite frankly. She went to a private school.
Mhm.
She was able to go, they were able to pay for her to go to the University of Michigan. It's real hard for me to sit there and listen to her complain about complain about the fact that her ponytail bounces instead of sways and that kind of stuff, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
A lot of us did not grow up with much privilege at all.
And so intersectionality is where these things all combine. So social class, I hear that a lot from students. Like there is like, if we have two people who are low income, they may have similar experiences based on their social class, but if one of them is Black and one of them is white, or one of them is man and one of them is a woman, they're going to have issues because of those other things. Does that make sense? So
Mhm.
like she may have had the privilege of social class, but in society, being a person of color has different challenges than someone who is white. And so we have to look at the pieces and how they all fit together. And so it's like, I'm white and Mexican. And so I tan really well during the summer, but my dad was a ginger. And so I look really white. But like, so I would go and do things with my dad and people would treat us differently than when I went with my mom who looks Mexican. And so they're the same socioeconomic level. They were the same, my mom cisgender, but female. But there are definitely different experiences. So like each of these categories has privilege. So you can have privilege in one group, one section, but like disadvantage in another. And so there are certain individuals who you're like, they probably have no disadvantages, right? Like the rich, white, straight men of the world probably don't have too many disadvantages, but they may, if they have disabilities or different things like that, like those can create these differences too. But it's like what we see is the baseline for society, like what everything's built off of. Like if there hasn't been a social movement for that group, then odds are pretty good that they have some sort of privilege. Does that make sense? Were you guys in my social movements class? Bob and Joyce, were you guys in that?
I think we missed some of them because we had other issues.
How dare you have a life? No, I'm just kidding. So in that I talked about feminism. So the idea for feminism would be, you know, women being equal to men, but there wasn't intersectionality added into that. And so a lot of that feminism was geared towards like white women and ignoring the needs of like women of color. And so just being a woman, like they were on the same playing field with being a woman, but there was differences because of their race. And so that creates some of those advantages or disadvantages depending on the group. And it's less that there's advantages, it's more like you're just not getting disadvantaged. because we see that those groups as the baseline. And so other non-dominating groups are, that's why I call it the minority text, because they're essentially like socially taxed for these things. Does that make sense at all?
I think almost everybody has disadvantages. And I tell you, not having money is a big disadvantage.
Oh, for sure.
It was my grandparents came over from Poland. So I'm third generation.
Mhm.
And my dad did not speak English when he started school. And so, those are the kinds of things. And people look at me and say, well, you've had it easy all your life. Well, I've worked hard all my life too. My husband's worked hard too.
Right.
So, but, I think, yeah, I do resent when somebody who says, I grew up with a lot of money and I went to this special school, these great schools, and has nothing to complain about, but somebody touching her hair, and and telling her how nice her hair is. I don't have time for that kind of thing. If it'd been one of the people, I grew in St. Cloud, Florida. When we moved there, they still were segregated.
Mhm.
The blacks lived out, quite frankly, it was called Shantytown.
Mhm.
If one of those people wrote a book about their experiences, I would listen because those experiences are real, and it is about a real discrimination.
Mhm.
That and to me that's a difference.
So
Everybody has their struggles, and you have to make the best of what you have, and to manufacture this kind of thing. I guess I don't have a lot of.
I just want to, there's okay, so like there is a whole thing about people touching Black women's hair. And Callie, would that be considered a microaggression? Is that what you would call that?
I would consider that. Yeah. So a lot of like, we may not see them as a big deal today, but it's like how it ties into historical context of like we have a tendency in a society to do all these little things that we may not see are a big deal, but it's like a power struggle thing. So it's like the fact that someone feels like they can just touch somebody. Or
Yeah.
an example would be like when you're pregnant, people can just feel like they can just touch your stomach. And you're like, I don't see why you think you can just touch me. Like,
Yeah, like this doesn't relate to hair at all, but like I do not like uninvited touch. Like I do not like it at all. And it, I cannot express to you how much I hate uninvited touch of
don't
any
hug
form.
Mara without
Hey,
us.
what kind of touch? I'm sorry, Mara.
Any kind of uninvited touch. So like if somebody puts their hand on my shoulder, or like it's different if somebody goes in for a handshake and I'm like, oh, okay, I can do that. But if somebody like touched my hair, like I've had that happen too. Oh no, I do not like that. Like I don't like going to concerts because there's a lot of opportunities for people to touch me, and I find it like oh my gosh, threatening. Like I find uninvited touch threatening. And that's part of my background, right? So like I just think like there are a lot of people who assume it's okay to just touch someone, and I hate it. So I just like, do not, like, please do not touch me unless like it's this like, oh yeah, we can have a hug and I'm giving you my consent for that. Like we both are okay with that, but it's like it's a power thing, I think.
It boils down to your ability to give consent and your bodily autonomy, where you're like, I'm like, I don't mind people touching me. I don't want to like hug strangers. Or my mother-in-law knows that I'm not huggy, so we just like wave when I leave now. But it's the ability for someone to consent. And so that ties back to historically not being able to have that bodily autonomy and things like that. And so it takes away the little power that they have of someone just like, I'm going to touch you, because they're taking that, like they feel like they can just do what they want to do. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm a hugger.
No, like that, yeah.
I don't know if it's, I don't, I grew up a lot of, like I said, moved from Pennsylvania to Florida, and it was a small town, and we hugged, and in church we hug, and
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm not
Uh,
demonizing hugging. Like I love a hug too, but
you want somebody to say, "Can I have a hug?"
Mhm.
I don't even need that. Can I have a hug? Sometimes I do actually, but like, I mean, I had I'm not going to say friend, an acquaintance, who he hugged people for so long,
Mhm.
it became uncomfortable. I felt trapped, and it wasn't just a me thing. Like it was like he just hugged people for too long, and I wanted out. It like made me uncomfortable, you know? So like I'm like there are people I can hug for a really long time. There are like I don't like Joyce, I would give you a hug. I would be fine with that,
Okay, yeah,
right?
good.
But but
When we see each other, we can hug, okay?
yes, we
Would that
can
be
hug.
good?
Vaccinated
We've
hugs, please.
communicated.
Vaccinated hugs.
Yes, I'm vaccinated. Yeah. So like
That's the thing I've missed in this pandemic is,
yeah, physical touch.
oh
Yeah.
goodness,
I
yep,
understand. But
being
yeah,
able to hug my people,
yeah.
hug my friends.
Yeah, it's yeah, but when somebody just I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, there are things that are okay and not okay. I love a hug. I do. I just don't like it when people who I barely know or like if somebody bumps into you and doesn't apologize, like all of these things add up for me. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, we should feel like we have control over our bodies and who touches it and who does what with it.
Hmm.
And so when someone takes it into their own hands and takes that away,
Yeah.
tied
Yeah.
into other historical issues. So Janice said that we've traveled many places with a Black majority. Many of the women kept touching my blonde daughter's hair. I find that also not okay.
Right.
Like,
I agree. Yeah. Elliot
like
has the curliest, most beautiful long hair you can possibly imagine. And just 2 weeks ago at the farmer's market, a woman came up to her and she almost went in for it. And I was like, oh no,
right,
she doesn't know you. I don't know you.
right. Even at
You
the
don't get
best
a
of
gift.
times, I'm not gonna let you touch her, but definitely not during a pandemic.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like I have curly hair. You guys saw it yesterday. Like,
Mhm.
and I've had people be like, and I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, do you think that this just shows up like this? Like, no, this was some work. Like, don't touch that. Like, and so, and when it comes to African American or Black women, hair is also a very sacred thing to them. And so it's more than just like if you were to touch somebody on the arm, it's a whole cultural thing with the hair. And so when, and that's one of those, like, you have to fully understand like that culture to understand why things are okay or not okay. Does that make sense? And so, yeah, I mean, so we've learned if we hug Mara, we have to ask. So,
It's true. I do
but
love consent. I love permission.
oh, I tell my son, like, consent is like the bare minimum. Like, there should be enthusiasm. If you're like, can I have a hug? And someone's like, yeah, like, yeah, they consent, but do you want to hug that person? Versus somebody's like, yes, like you want to hug that person. So consent's like bare minimum. Um, but yeah, anyway. So yeah, it's this idea that we have these ruling social norms that people don't even, some of them we don't even realize that they're ruling social norms. Like, we just do them and we don't think otherwise. And so unless you're looking at it from another perspective, it may just seem like, because we do a lot of stuff that's seen as like, I'm going to do it, normal to us, right? Or typical or common, that we do all the time that we don't necessarily think about. But when you look at it from a different perspective, whether that be from the lens of race or even like age, looking at things from a different age perspective can make it look differently and question, why we do things. Like when I was a teenager, I'd be like, well, why do I have to follow, XYZ rule? Like those are dumb. My mom was like, well, you'll understand when you're older. And then I got older and I was like, now I get it. Those were supposed to train me to just be a productive member of society and not be a little hooligan, right? And so she was only kind of successful. Okay, so I'm sure some of you have heard of Karl Marx. This is not Karl Marx, this is Bernie Madoff. But just for FYI. So Karl Marx was one of the people who was behind the concept of communism. We're not talking about communism, but essentially, so Marxism and neo-Marxism, they're like brothers, you could say. One is like the original idea of Marxism. The other one is like newer developed ideas of Marxism. So they tie together. But Marxism essentially sees crime and deviance as defined by the ruling class as and used as a means of social control. If you don't conform, then you will be punished. So through this lens, institutions such as police, justice system, prison, schools, family, religion, all encourage you to conform. So if you think about roles that we have in each of these groups. So when I have students who come into my classroom on the first day, they may not know anything about me, but they know how to conform as a student. So they find a desk, sit at it, face the front. If there's an arrangement of desks that doesn't have a situation where they face the authority position, then they get confused. Like when it's like round tables, they're like, hardly ever do they sit with their back towards the front of the room or the person who is seen as authority. So they've been conformed in a classroom setting, like those are the social norms of how you're supposed to act. They see those social norms as there being an authority figure, and they sit down and that's how they learn. So when we use different teaching styles, like a flipped classroom, where we put a lot of that in the hands of the students and then do facilitated activities in class, students can sometimes struggle because they're so used to that social norm of how education is supposed to look for them. And so this one ties into conflict theory, but this definitely looks more at social class. And so this specifically looks at how capitalism and crimes are tied together. So I don't know about you guys, but I've been in positions where I've been like, that person seems to have it all. Why are they committing crimes? Right? Like Bernie Madoff, like you have some money, like why do you need to have a Ponzi scheme to take more money from other individuals? Right? So if you guys are not familiar, Bernie Madoff was convicted of fraud with his Ponzi scheme of he essentially took money from individuals and then invested it in other stuff and rearranged it so he eventually got more money for him. So white collar crimes, and I actually didn't know this until last year, that the difference between like white collar and blue collar crimes are white collar crimes are typically nonviolent and financially motivated. And so they're seen as white collar because the people who commit those are of higher socioeconomic level. And I find it interesting because like we even have different classifications for these. So on a smaller scale, these are just like theft and different things like that, right? So, but with the more money that you're dealing with, they're going to be named differently, and people have a tendency to have different punishments based on how rich they are. So I've always found that interesting. So like a celebrity gets arrested for a crime that a normal person does, they either pay a giant fine, more than any normal person would have to pay, and don't have jail time, or if they do have jail time, it's like little. Like I think Khloe Kardashian, one of the Kardashian sisters, got a DUI and spent like, it was like her third maybe, and so it's required jail time, but she only spent like a handful of days in there, and she didn't even spend the number of days that she was supposed to. Versus in Iowa, I think it's a minimum of a year that you get if it's like your third DUI and it's a felony, something like that. And so these theories look at how capitalism makes people want to have more money. Like, yes, you may have money, but some is never enough when it comes to having that capitalist influence, right? Like, yes, you could be rich and have all sorts of money, but if you don't have as much money as someone else, as much money as you think that you should have, different things like that, then you can engage in deviant behavior, which can result in criminal activity. Does that make sense to everybody? So Karl Marx is more multifaceted than just like, hey, communism. He's got a lot of his stuff is about how the lower class is exploited by the wealthy class. And even if we look at the pandemic, to where people who were in corporate positions at Walmart were able to work from home and have sick days and things like that, versus people who are working, the hourly wage jobs in the stores weren't offered the same benefits. And so there's a social class divide there. And there is,
Callie,
yes.
I'm just, as I'm reading this and listening to all this, isn't it kind of ironic, if you would, that when you look at these communist governments, the same thing happens to them, that they're criticizing the capitalism or capitalists, because I look at like Putin, he's got pretty big stronghold on that country now, and other, things like that. So how does that play, how does that all fit in when they have these theories, but really once power happens, they turn into this, it's more power about having power than it is capitalism per se, or Marxism? How does that all fit into this?
So that would, incorporate other theories also. Essentially, we just have theories that and that I like to fit theories together to try to explain situations, because one theory is never going to explain all of it. But essentially, someone's always going to be in charge. And if you get rid of social classes, so if someone like the communists, they got rid of like that social ranking system, someone still came into power, right? Like someone's still going to emerge, and it may be on the basis of something besides like money, but it's still going to happen. So even if we took away people's money, so even now I've noticed it with the younger generation with like influencers. So people who are on social media and they have a presence, that's almost worth more than money in certain situations, because they have they have power. And so removing one power structure doesn't get rid of any of the other ones. And there's always going to be another power structure that pops up. And so I personally think that dives into how individuals operate. And so let's see, Jana said, she recommends The American Scandal, season 24 on Bernie Madoff, as well as season 23, Tulsa Race Massacre. I love a good podcast. I do. And I feel like podcasts are a great way to get information that is not, because obviously I talked about earlier, who owns the media companies, they decide what goes out. But with podcasts, like little nobodies can share ideas and truths, and they're great. So with social media podcasts, like you're able to get like a new wave of individuals, but even that will end up in some sort of hierarchy structure, right? Oh, did we lose Kim?
We've lost her a couple times. She usually logs back in.
Okay. Then I won't answer her question anymore if she's gone. But does that make sense to everybody? So it's like, there's always going to be a power structure. In the United States, it just happens, like a big one just happens to be money and people's desire to get more money.
Here she comes. She's
Oh, there
back.
she is.
Sorry about that. I don't know. It must be on my end because it's happened twice now. So
Yeah. You keep
I'll
coming
catch
back
the
though.
recording. You don't have to repeat it all.
Did that make sense though, Kim, like what I described?
What you started to, I kind of like cut out at the last minute or two. I lost my
Okay.
connection. So, but I'll catch it on the flip on the recording. You can
On the
move
flip
forward.
side.
The flip side, yeah.
All right. So there's
Sorry, we've got a visual and an unmuting of Bill. So I feel
Ooh.
he's got something to share.
got thoughts, Bill.
I have heard it said, and this is a while ago, that pure communism would be a really ideal situation. But the problem is it doesn't work. And what the Soviet Union had was supposed to be a transition to pure communism. And of course, what happened is it didn't work because just what you said, there's always a power struggle. There's always somebody rising to the top. And so what the Russia has now is not pure Marxism at all.
Right.
The same with China, I'm sure.
People think that I'm crazy when I say that like pure communism isn't about like it's this idea of a utopia where everyone is equal and well, we're all participating in society and carrying our own weight and different things like that. Like it's also one of those that looks good on paper, but we are humans who err and that leads more into like the psychological human existence versus like the sociological structures and things like that. And so, yeah, humans err, like even the best laid out systems, there's human error. And so humans have their own motivations. And so power has definitely gotten in the way of quite a few good ideas, unfortunately. All right. So, all right, I got 18 minutes left. See what I can do here. Okay, so labeling theory. This is one I always find super interesting. So labeling theory is the idea that people live up to the expectation of being labeled as a deviant individual. So in like the 1970s, it was like the hippies and those who listened to rock and roll music. In the 80s, it was like those who were punk. In the 90s, it was like the grunge music influence. I'm not far enough back to see what the 2000s was yet, but it has kind of this cycle. So it's like there's these main beliefs that we have, and they have this influence on individuals. So if someone is labeled a bad student, okay? So there's a belief that they're a bad student. They have this influence of the expectations of what they have for a bad student. Whether that is, you don't expect them to turn their work in on time, you don't expect them to do good work. That then influences the behavior of the student because they're like, oh, well, the expectations are low. Why am I going to try so hard? Which then leads into the results of them engaging in that deviant behavior. So it's this circle because it just reinforces like the idea that they had originally that that person is a bad student. So if we have the label of like someone is a punk, okay, people are going to treat that individual how they expect a punk, like the stereotypical punk, to act, right? And then if somebody's like, well, if you're going to treat me like that, then I might as well just be like that anyway. So even if they weren't like that originally, there was the idea like, okay, well, if you're going to think that I'm, doing X, Y, Z anyway, well, I might as well do it if I'm going to get blamed for it, right? So then they do this behavior, which then results in them like being more of what they said they were. That just reinforces the belief that they are that individual. Does that make sense? So it's like if a cop pulls somebody over and treats them like they are a criminal, then the expectation is they're going to act a certain way. So if an individual acts that way, then it's just going to reinforce, it's just this wheel that just goes around and around. And it can be in a lot of different situations. So individuals adopt the behaviors, actions, attitudes, and beliefs that are associated with the label given. This applies stigma to the label or to those that are given the label. So because this cycle has happened before, if someone engages in those behaviors, they're likely to be labeled quickly. So there's this thing called the McDonald triad. I find fascinated by serial killers. So the McDonald triad is that a serial killer, 3 behaviors to look out for is wetting the bed, setting fires, and I can't remember what the other one is. Killing animals. And so where before this, if somebody was engaging in that behavior, they'd be like, oh, that's weird. Like, that's like, if someone's just wetting the bed or doing these things, they're like, okay. But once that got tied to the concept of that was often associated with those who went on to do deviant behavior and eventually serial killers. So if someone sees a behavior in this kid and they start to treat them like with gloves, like, oh, are you going to be dangerous? Are you not going to be dangerous? Then this kid is like, okay, so it has that influence. Then that kid is expecting to be treated like that and they respond. And so again, with this circle, so it reinforces that idea that they might have. So this ties into this thing called retrospective labeling, that it's what it does is it looks at things that individuals have done after they've done it. So this is Ted Bundy. For those of you who are aware, he was a serial killer, but he was like Mr. Charming and was seen as fairly normal. And people didn't think anything really about his behavior until he was arrested. He was arrested several times, Colorado, Florida, and started to be convicted of these things. Then they looked back on his behavior and they're like, oh, okay, so that and that and that were all deviant behavior, right? So the example that I have there is the Columbine high school shooting, where the actions leading up to the incident were labeled as deviant due to the nature of the shooting. So maybe these behaviors wouldn't be seen as deviant on their own, but because this crime eventually occurs, that retrospective look, and they're like, oh, yep, those are deviant behaviors. Like, so the difference between 2 individuals who do the exact same thing, if someone eventually does something, typically a crime, people are going to look back on that person's behavior and see it as deviant, but they may not see this person's behavior as deviant because something never tipped it over the edge, you could say. So this can be seen in many criminal cases when individuals first are shocked that a person they know or have a preconceived notion about commits a crime. Then they start to look at the behaviors prior to the crime as deviant when they did not see them that way before due to the influence of the crime that was committed. So I watch a lot of crime shows. I listen to a lot of crime podcasts. And it's amazing how many times people are like, they were such a nice person. Like, I didn't know that they were capable of this. And then they'll be like, oh, but I guess they did do X, Y, Z. And so behaviors that may be in that acceptable deviant range may cross over into like full unacceptable deviance with the hindsight is 2020 lens that we have. Does that make sense? And so labeling past events deviant because of something that has occurred as retrospective labeling, while labeling theory overall can also be broken into labeling them as they occur and having this influence throughout this circle as it's happening. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Yep. Labeling theory is one of my favorites with this because I find that social influence has a lot of impact on how people respond. So there have been studies that show that when students are encouraged and supported and believe that they're a good student, that they live up to those expectations. And so, but the same is true if we label students as deviant or the bad kid or things like that. And so it's been kind of a new-ish trend that I've noticed that they won't allow teachers to ask the previous teacher about students. because they don't want to have this influence on that behavior. So I guess newish to me because I have only been teaching for a handful of years, but it makes sense though, like to have a student come into your class and treat them with a blank slate rather than having this continuous deviant bad kid label on them, which would then influence their behavior. Because if they think the teacher thinks they're a bad kid anyway, like, why am I going to try to live up to something more that's never going to change their mind? Does that make sense to everybody? And so, okay. So overall, that's the end of my slideshow. There, essentially, I hope you guys have learned that anyone can be deviant. In society, it depends on where you're at, who you are, time frame, on what is seen as deviant and what's not seen as deviant. And so, I mean, we could all be doing deviant behavior right now, depending on different cultures, right? Like, because isn't sloth technically one of the 7 deadly sins? And we're sitting here, right? So we're being deviant by sitting around for an hour and a half. Some societies, this would be seen as deviant because as the 2 women in charge here, we're women, right? Like in some societies, it's deviant for women to be in charge. So we doing just what we would normally do could be seen as deviant no matter where you are.
Lame.
I know. But you know, what's the saying? Well-behaved women rarely make history. So
yeah. Let me just say, no sloth here. We've been learning,
right?
been exercising our minds. So
true. Right. And everybody's been engaging for the most part. So it's not like you're just sitting there mindlessly listening to me. Right. Or maybe it's greed because we're greedy for information.
Oh, maybe it's everything.
It's everything. We're doing everything right and everything wrong all at the same time.
Yeah.
That's essentially what it's like to be a mother.
Or just a human.
Right.
Just a human. Yeah. Well, I'm impressed. I did not think you were going to get done on time.
Oh. I've learned with certain topics that I only give myself like 5 slides because I know that I'm going to go over.
Well, color me impressed. Any last comments or questions for Callie? So,
I'm absolutely loving this. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you everyone for being here. I love all the input and the discussion and all the stuff.
This is also our opportunity to try and force Callie to do a class for us next semester. She got a different position at a different community college, so she's not going to be at WIT. But she could still teach via Zoom. So I would love for you guys to flood her with pleads.
That's why it's so messy back here, because I'm moving. So that's my pile of stuff.
Say while she's taking on an entire new position and job, still do a little classy class for us. So I will include Callie's email on our email out too with the recording. But my deadline is next week, so we've got a little time sensitivity going here.
Okay. And it may be one of those, like if it doesn't work for the fall, we may be able to work for spring. That's probably more likely.
Okay.
Because I have no idea what my fall is going to look like. I'm moving to Fort Dodge.
Which is unfortunate, but
yeah,
fine.
and engaging in deviant behavior because my husband will still live here. So we'll be living apart. And so according to some cultures, they're like,
you got it. You'll be fine.
How dare I be a strong, independent woman?
Yeah. Bob and Joyce, I saw an unmute. Anything you'd like to share?
Thank you for this course. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to another one.
There we go.
Mara's like, do it. Tell her how great she is.
Mara, we're losing a lot of our instructors.
I know.
Jean
I know. Our watercolor instructor moved to Wisconsin.
Oh.
I know. It's heartbreak across the board, but somehow we'll have to muddle on.
Always have to.
Always.
Deviant code.
See, you wanted that though. Okay. Thank you, Callie, so much. And thank you everybody for taking the class. I will send
Thank
out
you.
the recording as soon as I have it. And I hope everyone has a safe, wonderful summer.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.